All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and introduce you, but first of all, welcome everybody. This is the Primary Text Certificate Program's Fall 2020 Live Ideas Lecture. This program and this lecture series, as well as an undergraduate journal, is funded by the Redbud Foundation, so thank you to the Redbud Foundation. And I will be adding some links for your reference to the program and the journal and this lecture series in the chat. And I'll also put some links to Dr. Deneen's books in the chat as time goes by. So thank you for attending. Patrick Deneen is Professor of Political Science and David A. Potenziani, Memorial College Chair of Constitutional Studies at the University of Notre Dame. He's the founding director of the Tocqueville Forum at Georgetown University and founding member of the Front Porch Republic, founding editor of the journal Front Porch Republic. He is the author of the Odyssey of Political Theory, Democratic Faith, Conserving America, Thoughts on Present Discontents, and most recently, Why Liberalism Failed from Yale University Press, 2018. This book was recommended by President Barack Obama for his summer 2018 reading list. Today, Dr. Deneen is going to speak to us about the crisis of liberalism and the way forward. And afterwards, we should have some time for Q&A. So you're welcome to put your questions for Dr. Deneen in the chat. All right, with that, I'll turn it over to you. Oh, Dr. Deneen, I think you're muted.
My first faux pas. Here's my second faux pas. I should have asked, is it possible for me to share some PowerPoint slides on the screen? I think there's like a share screen.
Absolutely. Just
okay.
Hit share screen
okay.
and then choose the.
Okay. Got it. Okay. I think I'll do that because I don't want you to have to look at me for the next hour and a half or so. So the discussion is about the crisis of liberalism, and so the first thing we need to do in some ways is put some definitions on the table. And obviously we would have to begin, what do we mean by liberalism? And I think if you've grown up as a citizen in the United States during the 20th or 21st century, we typically associate the word liberalism with the left portion of the American political spectrum. So typically Democratic Party, people who hold a set of values that are, we would probably commonly agree upon are, represent the more left, liberal, progressive side of the American political spectrum. Now, if you go to Europe and most European countries, you say the word liberal, they'll think what you mean are what we typically call conservatives. They'll think what you mean especially are libertarians, people who believe in free market economics, little regulation on commercial interactions as well as personal interactions. So the word liberal is pretty convoluted in our politics. I actually want to talk about liberalism more as a philosophical idea that has deep roots in Enlightenment philosophy, especially the political philosophy coming out of roughly 500 years ago, associated with the Protestant Reformation, the early thinkers in the social contract tradition, whom I'll mention, but thinkers like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, and obviously influenced not only our founding fathers, the founding fathers of the American order, the famous stars of that Broadway musical, Hamilton, as well as more recent thinkers, 20th century thinkers who we would describe as progressive. So the people that we usually think of as liberal, either on the left or the right political scale, are actually, by my definition, all liberals because they partake in this liberal tradition. So maybe one way to begin to elucidate on what I mean or what is meant by this idea of liberalism is to turn maybe to a little bit of a comparison by what it's not. Sometimes we can get a better idea of what it's not by engaging in a little bit of contrast. And I'll try to share a PowerPoint Are you seeing that now? Okay. So this thinker is Alexis de Tocqueville. I don't know if any of you have read Tocqueville, Tocqueville, if we're speaking French. This was a deeply insightful, extremely in many ways prophetic thinker who was raised in France, in the west part of France, in Normandy, and actually in the 75th anniversary of the American invasion of Normandy, I had the opportunity to go to Normandy to visit some of the sites of the Allied invasion of the western coast of France, but also to visit Tocqueville's homestead, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Tocqueville grew up in this western part of France, but became involved with politics in his 19th century France, which was very, in some ways not all that different from ours. It was extremely tumultuous. There was literally regime change taking place, where you had, the monarchist party taking over and then being succeeded by the revolutionary party. So this is in the period after the French Revolution, where things were very unsettled in France. And Tocqueville was on the side of a kind of moderate liberal, the moderate liberal side of the political equation today. We could think of him as a kind of, who would we might compare him to? Kind of the first George Bush in kind of his disposition. Not really far to the right, obviously not to the left. And this made it very uncomfortable, as in some ways that position is uncomfortable today. We have much more extremes of the left and the right in our politics today. And so Tocqueville decided, and he had the opportunity to leave France for a bit of time, sort of to let things cool down there. And he took a very famous trip to the United States in the late 1820s, took extensive notes, and wrote up these notes ultimately in a 2-volume book called Democracy in America. And this book is, it remains, I think, a central text, not only to Americans who attempt to understand themselves, but I think across the world for people trying to understand this phenomenon, which was new at the time, the phenomenon of liberal democracy. Tocqueville had, in one passage, he talks about one way of thinking about liberal democracy as the ideal of achieving equal liberty. This is a passage that occurs in book 2, volume 2, chapter 1. So volume 2, book 2, chapter 1. And it's one in which he discusses the relationship of equality and liberty. And while he concludes in that chapter that sort of Americans, democratic peoples, will prefer equality over liberty, he makes some provisos at the beginning of that passage. He begins by saying that liberal democracy seeks to achieve the most complete form that equality can take on earth, and goes on then to say that this condition can be imagined as an extreme point in which freedom and equality touch each other and intermingle. It's a sort of poetic way to put it, but in which in some ways they become quite similar. They begin to take on characteristics of the other. And then I think he clarifies what he means by this. He says, then with none differing from those like them, no one will be able to exercise a tyrannical power, so that everyone is free from any effort by someone else to exercise any kind of arbitrary rule upon oneself. In this condition, he says, men will be perfectly free because they will be entirely equal. And they will be perfectly equal because they will be entirely free. This is the ideal toward which democratic peoples tend. So you could say, as I put the title of the slide, this is the telos of liberal democracy. This is what it tends toward, is a condition in which we are perfectly equally free from each other. So we are no longer in any way can anyone say, in any aspect of my life, is anyone able to tell me what to do, what to think, what to be, who I am, what I want to become. And this is the condition of what he describes as equal liberty, the kind of telos of liberal democracy. Now, this is an idea that we might think this is, of course, obvious. This is, of course, obvious what liberal democracy is. But Tocqueville is seeing this at a time when, of course, not only is this does this not exist in the late 1820s in the United States, but it certainly doesn't exist in the world from which he comes, from France that even has gone through the revolution. This is a picture I took of Tocqueville's nice house. This is the estate that he grew up on, the CHATEAU de Tocqueville. And you can actually, when we can travel again, and when you make a lot of money, or if you have a lot of money, you can go to this chateau. It's actually, they run part of it as a kind of nice, prestigious hotel now. I didn't actually stay there, but I got to walk around on the grounds. But this was the home that he grew up in. And what really strikes me about this estate, so to go back, if we think of his name is Alexis de Tocqueville. And if you know some French, what you know that means is that he is of Tocqueville. The de, like my name, Deneen, I'm of Neen, of the famous estate of Neen, of course. Sorry, bad joke. But Tocqueville was of Tocqueville, which meant he was of this place, which was literally called Tocqueville. This little part of Western France is the name of a place. But of course, it's also the name of his family, and it's the name of the estate. It's the name of the actual building. So Tocqueville, as an heir of an aristocratic lineage, right, who had been given this estate, his family had been given this estate in roughly around 1066, after the invasion of William the Conqueror. And this was one of the rewards that the Normans received when they invaded England. That they received estates, lands, and so forth. That Tocqueville's name literally tells us who he is, right? If we think about it. His name tells us that he is this person who is of this place. And think about this in terms of the world in which I think you could say that most human beings lived in until fairly recently. Think about names. Let's just think about the kind of common names that many, let's say, Americans or British people, until maybe more recently, might have had. Your name told you essentially who you were, what you were. And so if your name was that very common name of Smith, it told you that you were from a family of Smiths, or that you were a Smith. That's what you did. You worked as a smithy. Or if your name was Taylor, again, one of those common names. Taylor meant you were the person who, hemmed pants and made nice suits. And we could go through all of these kind of classic names, especially of the British tradition, the Anglo-British, the WASP tradition. Weaver, you would be someone who worked by a loom. And Cooper, I don't know if anybody knows what a Cooper is, but a Cooper is someone who makes barrels. And we could keep going on with these, with all of these names that reflected what one's profession was. But it wasn't only the kind of Anglo-British tradition that you saw these kinds of names defining who you were. My own tradition, Irish Catholic, your name told you who you were from. If you typically had the name O in your name, that was literally an abbreviation for of. And so this is a picture of Mrs. O'Leary, who anyone who knows of the famous Chicago fire her cow is reputed to have knocked over the lantern there on the left bottom side, and started the great Chicago fire that burned much of the city in the 19th century. So the O in this case indicates that she is of a man named Leary, that who she is was defined by who she came from. And we could do this for a lot of other traditions. You could think of Polish tradition, for example. The last part of many Polish names is Ski, S-K-I, which means child of or son of. Or you can think of the Scandinavian tradition. Literally, Johansson means the son of Johann. The female version is something like Johansdottir, the daughter of Johann, and this would be your name. It would be who you came from. Or we could go back even further and think of figures like Thomas of Aquinas or John of Paris, these great philosophers whose names indicated where they came from. So in a different world and in a different time, and we could say for much of human history, who we are was in many ways indicated by who we came from, where we came from. And that in some ways defined the essence of what it was, who we were as human beings. Now, what changed? Well, I mean, obviously a lot of things changed. We can look to economics, we can look to material forces in the world. But as a political philosopher, I really look to changes and revolutions in ideas. And really, you would have to look at these couple of these figures that I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, thinkers in the early period of the Enlightenment, who began to rethink the basis of our political society. And we can look at a figure like Thomas Hobbes, who I'll talk about in a little bit, but especially the figure John Locke, whose years were 1632 to 1704, but whose 1689 book, the two treatises on government, in some ways you could say literally created a revolution. In the second of those treatises, which again is really one of the great texts of the Western tradition, it's a text that any student who's interested in some sense in knowing where we came from, right? I mean, every human being, it seems to me, wants to know where we came from. And if you don't read the second treatise on government, you don't actually get to know where we came from, because John Locke's ideas in that book deeply influenced, among others, Thomas Jefferson, the author of the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, and the text that really, in many ways, provides the rationale for the American Revolution, the separation from England, the creation of the United States as its own sovereign country. And then, as they say, the rest is history. John Locke offers a kind of revolutionary idea of what freedom is. In this older tradition, the kind of pre-liberal tradition, freedom was understood to be a condition of a kind of self-discipline, we could say. That when you were free, when you exercised discipline over the parts of yourself or the parts of your political order that tend to be disorderly. Right? So we can think of this, in modern terms, we can think of, my inclination is to want to sit around eating Doritos and drinking, Coke until 3 a.m., watching Netflix, binging on Netflix. But if I'm self-disciplined, I will, not eat these bad foods and drink this bad stuff, and I'll go to bed early and I'll get up early and go exercise. And that's a kind of self-discipline. This was the classical and Christian understanding of what freedom was, that when you governed the more unruly part of your nature, you were free. This is what freedom was. And we can think about this in societal terms as well, that the forces in society that tend toward unruliness, toward unlawfulness, it's in some ways the argument of these classical authors, what this is an ever-present threat. And so political order needs to be self-governing as well. There needs to be the inculcation of lawfulness and law-abidingness, and a concern for justice, in particular the just application of laws and the just acceptance of the legitimacy of those laws. And of course, this calls then into question what is the nature of a good ruler. If you read figures like Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, and so forth, you'll see a lot of these arguments. Now, this idea of freedom as a kind of self-discipline and a self-governance was accompanied in this tradition, in this sort of pre-modern tradition, by arguments that in order to achieve this condition of self-discipline, one needs to develop high degrees of virtue. And you hear this language of virtue always sort of articulated by these classical thinkers until really early modern times, that you could say the goal of human society is to cultivate virtue in the citizenry, in individual human beings. And in order to cultivate virtue, you need to have sort of thick institutions that form these kinds of virtuous characters. So you need the kinds of cultural institutions, obviously families, the training of virtue. Aristotle recognizes this. Training of virtue begins when you're very young, right? Your parents tell you to go brush your teeth. You say why, they say because I said so. This is the habituation in virtue, not because we know what virtue is when we're very young, but because we are being trained in certain kinds of habits, as Aristotle argues. You need then sort of strong family institutions. You need strong civil institutions. You need strong religious institutions. You need a kind of culture of cultivation of these kinds of virtuous characters. And this is the long-standing argument you'll encounter, especially in pre-modern philosophy, ethics, political philosophy. But I think what you can say is that what modernity and thinkers like Locke conclude is that these very thick forms of virtue-forming institutions take on a character of authoritarianism. Right? They are authoritative, right? When your parents tell you to brush your teeth because I said so, that's kind of tyrannical, right? I mean, they don't offer reasons. I mean, eventually they do. But you could say that one of the ways we could describe the Enlightenment is a kind of the conclusion and rejection that the end and purpose of politics should be ultimately the cultivation of virtue, if by that it requires these kinds of extensive, sort of thick institutions that are supposed to shape who we are. And so John Locke, following in the footsteps of Thomas Hobbes, argues for something different. He says, when we think about what freedom is, what liberty is, it's not self-discipline. Freedom is a condition in which I basically do what I want to do. And the ultimate form of freedom, we can understand, is human beings in their natural state. This is the famous state of nature theory. So we encounter the state of nature theory in the second treatise on government. And this is the definition that Locke gives. And you'll see that it's pretty similar to what Tocqueville describes some several hundred years later. John Locke writes that the state of perfect freedom is something that we see in a time and in a place before there's any government, before there are any real sort of established human institutions. And the state of freedom, the state of liberty, is the state of one in which we have the liberty or the freedom to order our actions and dispose of our possessions and our persons, that is to say, to act as we wish, as we see fit, within the bounds of the laws of nature, which Locke says means not killing someone else, and without asking leave or depending upon the will of any other man. Now, we would read this today and say, of course, right? But we've been shaped by this philosophy. Of course, this is obvious to us because we are modern Americans, at least probably many of us listening, or modern to the extent that we're modern liberals from anywhere in the world. We recognize this because it has shaped the modern world. Locke's argument gets taken up in a kind of philosophical, not just in a philosophical way, but in a political way, in an actionable political way, especially in the American Revolution. And so we have a world in which we tend to think of freedom in this Lockean way, right? In precisely the idea that freedom is when there is no obstacle or little obstacle as possible to the realization of being able to do what I want to do, to dispose of myself and my possessions as I see fit. And I think if you were to ask any roommate, any of your friends, even maybe your own self, what is freedom? This is the definition that people would give. Right? I'm going to jump over this. And so we live in a world in which we still have these names. It's sort of worth noting, right? And so the younger people won't recognize who this is, but this is Dennis Weaver, who was a famous actor in like the 1970s, often played cowboy characters. But you recognize some of these other people if I put up their pictures. Bradley Cooper, I don't think is making barrels, at least not recently. Here's one of my favorites, Taylor. Here's Taylor, who's not even her last name, Taylor Swift, whose brother went to my university, the University of Notre Dame, and actually was on campus and did some jogging on campus and was caught wearing some of our gear. I actually had her brother in one of my classes and didn't even realize that he was Taylor Swift's brother until the very end of the semester. So I wasn't able to leverage this relationship into any valuable sort of autograph or something. The reason I point out, just as by way of example, that there becomes a detachment of what were the signs of who we were, based upon who we come from, where we come from, what career has been given to us, what our profession is to be because it was my father's or my mother's profession. I think we have to see is not just the way things always were. If you grow up in this world, you assume this is just the way things are. This is actually a fairly recent phenomenon, really very recent if we think about the history of humanity. It's actually, you could say it's an experiment that's been taking place for about 200 years. We're still in the midst of this experiment. Right? It was literally called an experiment by the founders of America, where we're going to engage in this experiment. We're going to do something completely new. So who you are, the human being that you are, will be the result entirely of your own choices. Right? And if you're a student today, that is both a condition of extreme and profound liberation. To be told you can grow up and be president of the United States, right? Maybe no one wants to do that anymore. But you can grow up and sort of be what you want to be. And that's a condition of extreme liberation. What Tocqueville also recognizes in this book, Democracy in America, it's also the source of a lot of anxiety. Because when when you exist in the world knowing that the sum of your choices shape who you are, you're completely responsible for the person that you are and the person that you become. Your successes and your failures, in some senses, are all on you, or at least that's what we come to believe. And just to think about maybe if you had any agonies over what your major would be, what clubs you would join, what university you would attend. I mean, any of the kinds of typical agonies that we have to confront in our early 20s, late teens, and trust me, these don't stop. All are due to the fact that it's hard to know. It's hard to know what choices are correct in a world in which who you are is almost in some ways completely the result of those choices. In order to become these kinds of human beings that I've just been describing, the Taylors, the Coopers, and the Weavers who make ourselves, in some ways you have to say that what modern liberalism in its essence is a collective effort to make possible the creation of ourselves, to make possible this project of self-creation. So while you could say liberalism, if we think of someone like John Locke, liberalism begins with the argument or the claim that we are by nature free and equal. Right? So if we could take any human being out of whatever time you're born into, whatever place you're born into, and put you down in the state of nature, what we would find is that what the essence of what we are isn't where I happen to be born, to whom I happen to be born, when I happen to be born. Right? The state of nature, what the state of nature really is, it's a place that's not a place, and it's a time that's not a time, and it's a space in which there is no inheritance, right? In which you haven't no aspect of what you are is the result of something that somebody else gave to you, your identity. You're not the child of such and such a father and a mother. That's what the state of nature is. Now, this is what Locke and before him Hobbes describes as our nature, right? What exists by nature, if we could sort of strip human beings down to their essence. But what we actually know is that human beings are not these creatures, right? When we see human beings in any time and place, even in a liberal society to a great extent, what we know is that people, right, think about, your freshman year maybe, and, your first weeks in the dormitory. What are the first things you ask your fellow classmates? Who are you? Where did you come from? What do your parents do? You ask those things that identify someone as what you came from. We know that human beings aren't genuinely free and equal, that in the condition of sort of real world, we're not the creatures that exist by nature, according to someone like Locke. But liberal philosophy, in a way you could say, doesn't simply ultimately describe, doesn't seek merely to describe. It actually seeks to shape a world in which our aspiration becomes to be as much as possible those creatures that are described in the state of nature. Right? So while it purports to describe this condition, it actually shapes us over a long period of time. And that we become more and more like those creatures described in the state of nature, in which to be a successful modern liberal human being is to detach oneself as much as possible from those shaping forces and institutions, because that's what it is to be genuinely free, what we would today call authentic. And if you think about it, to be authentic, it means that you chose everything of what you are, right? To be inauthentic means somehow you're doing something that you didn't choose. So this ideal of authenticity is a kind of ultimate goal of a liberal world. And so in a liberal world, what we would see is that in the process of making individuals means that we have to be freed from what were once thought to be those essential institutions and relationships that were especially important in shaping and forming the virtuous character. So we're going to be free from associations. Right? And if you know anything about some social science research, one of the things that social science continuously finds is that as America has aged, as modern America has proceeded, someone like Robert Putnam at Harvard University finds that we are increasingly disassociated from each other. That's one of the hallmarks of the modern world, certainly increasingly of modern America. And Putnam wrote a famous book called Bowling Alone, in which he, a really great sort of way to phrase this book, he discovered that people are continuing to bowl in the same numbers as they used to, but they don't bowl in bowling leagues anymore. They bowl alone. So that as a kind of symbol of the way in which our associational life has declined. We see, of course, a growing and indeed a cascading liberty from religious institutions. And the students who are in the room, as it were, in your rooms, I think probably experience this or see this among your classmates or even in yourself, that the younger the generation in America today, the more likely there is no identification with a religious institution or tradition. In fact, a growing number of younger people describe themselves as, this catchphrase, spiritual but not religious, which means I have a sense of spirituality, but there's no institutional form which I see it aligning with. And of course, we're seeing statistically a decline of the number of people who self-identify as participants in some religious institutional tradition. We're seeing a liberty from marriage, right? The declining numbers of people who are marrying, and consequently liberation from the next generation, the declining number of people who are having children. As a result of that, people not having children, it means more and more young people are growing up in households where they are the only child. And so growing up in a world in which they are not growing up with people that are sort of their own age, which is kind of an important thing, and you might think is kind of socialization of human beings, is learning how to play nice with other people. Not always necessarily nice if you have brothers and sisters, but learning how to negotiate with your people your own age in your own household. We're seeing declining numbers of people who say that they have close friends, or the declining number of close friends that people say that they have. And I have all the statistics that show this, that there's been a decline in the number of people that people will identify as being close friends that's occurred over the last 20 years, something like from 5 to 1. So in 1980, people said they had 5 close friends, and today people say they have 1 or 1.3 close friends. And what has been described in several articles as lonely America, the rise of a kind of lonely America. So let me move to the conclusion of the argument of my book, Why Liberalism Failed. And the nub of the argument in my book is that liberalism failed. What I argue is the kind of crisis of our contemporary moment is that liberalism has failed because it has succeeded, because it set out to achieve what its architects envisioned as the good life for human beings. And I'm just going to focus on 2 of the arguments. I make more arguments in my book, but I want to just focus on 2 of these, and I'll try to do this briefly. and move on to a conclusion. So the first of the reasons why I think liberalism fails is because in order to make ourselves into individuals, liberalism required the creation of several pretty massive tools to free human beings from all these kinds of relationships that I described in the last slide, the family, associations, religion, and so forth. And the first of these is the growth of the modern state. Now, liberalism, you might say, we think of it as limited government, and that's true. But when we say limited government, what that really means is that government is limited to the ends it can pursue. And in particular, what government can't do in a liberal society is to tell you, you should live this way because this is what virtue requires. This is what the cultivation of virtue requires. But what the limited ends of the state, what those include is freeing people from the what are seen as arbitrary limitations of our liberty, right? The arbitrary limits on self-creation. And so in pursuit of that limited end, you can actually have a very powerful, and you're actually going to need a very powerful government. And it's arguable that there's never been a more powerful central government ever in the history of the world than a liberal government. Certainly the American government is a very powerful institution. Sort of the ancient kings and aristocrats would have been jealous of the power of the state in modern liberal societies. The second major tool of our liberation becomes the global marketplace. Right? Where is it that we enjoy our liberty more than in that space where we are the sovereign choosers, right? And we become the sovereign choosers, right? There should be, when we think of what a market is, there should be essentially no limits to what it is we choose and what we desire. And this encroaches into really every aspect of life. It's not just commercial transactions, but it's the way that we think, for example, about education, right? The role of faculty in determining what it is you have to learn, which was once pretty extensive, right? Down to the books you would have to read, not just in the course, but in the time during your time as a student in a university, more or less almost your entire course load and the books in those courses were determined by faculty because that's what a curriculum was. But now we have a much more market-based model of what education is, and people, should have extensive choices in thinking about their education. Or, hit maybe even closer to home, thinking about the dating culture and how we tend to think of the dating world as a kind of marketplace now. And if you have certain apps on your phone where you can swipe in certain directions, you begin to see other human beings as products that I can choose and engage in some relationship with for whatever period of time, but that the globe becomes a kind of a marketplace of dating, in contrast to how it might have been generations ago, where you would probably be set up by a friend of your parents or something. It wouldn't be a global marketplace. It would be sort of a determination. This is the kind of person you should marry. This is the kind of person you should date. And the last tool I would mention is our technology. And I mean technology in a very specific way. Human beings have always used technology, and we could say that almost everything that is a kind of human creation is a kind of technology. But the technology that we have really embraced and adopted, and the way that we tend to use it is to emphasize a priority upon our liberation from each other, to allow for us, again, to engage in this project of self-creation. Now, what I would, and again, I could say a lot more about all three of these tools, but what I would want to emphasize about these tools is that these are all seek to be mechanisms, I'll describe it as following: depersonalized mechanisms of individuation. These are all mechanisms by which we can, that don't require any actual obligation on our part to the sort of fates of other human beings. I think you see this especially in government and the market. Right? So we debate constantly in our politics, what's better, free market or more government? But in fact, both of them are these depersonalized tools and mechanisms of individuation in which, if we decide as a society that we should be helping out the poor, we're not going to be obligated to do that out of my own goodwill and the sort of obligations that I have personally to you. We're going to try to maximize the ways in which we can do that so that I don't actually have any personal obligation to you. I can do this through the payment of my taxes and then distributions through a kind of distant government. So that the aim becomes that we decrease any sense of personal obligation and duty, and therefore, kind of requirements of reciprocity and obligation as a consequence of that. Here's the other aspect of these three tools, is that if you notice the way that these tools have been talked increasingly about in recent years, these tools have become, in some ways, our masters, or we perceive them as our masters, that we no longer control them. As citizens, we think increasingly that we no longer control the state, right? That the state is no longer responsive to us, that it's become, in the words of some, it's become the deep state. It's become this sort of, massive organization that is no longer subject to citizen control. And the way in which increasingly citizens express their dissatisfaction with this, and you notice in these days, is through protests. Right? Protests on the streets. And this is true on both the left and the right, sort of Tea Party movement or Occupy Wall Street and BLM and so forth. But these aren't necessarily expressions of power. These are in some ways expressions of a kind, or admissions of a kind of weakness. That as citizens, all we can do is sort of shout, gather and shout, and demand some kind of response. That as citizens, we seem to exercise relatively little choice or power over the centralized state as citizens. And we see the same kind of sort of argument or description of the market as sort of a kind of autonomous entity that has taken on its own life. There's no way you can control the market now. And we saw this in the last decade about arguments about globalization. There's no way to stop globalization. And we're seeing it today in arguments about automation. And this, of course, touches on technology, that automation is inevitable. There's no way to stop automation. And so people are going to have to figure out ways to occupy themselves either through some other kind of work or hobbies in a world in which a lot of work is going to go away. And that was kind of the platform of Andrew Yang in the Democratic primary this past year, was basically most of us are going to be obsolete in the coming years. Let me touch on the second and the second argument for why liberalism has failed. And I think this one is maybe even more obvious to us, that liberalism, if you think about the world that Tocqueville lives in, liberalism is an aristocratic society. Pre-liberal society is often an aristocratic society. So people hold their position in society on the basis of what they were born into. And that's one of the reasons liberalism comes into being, is to say it's not right that some people are lords and some people are serfs, some people are masters and some people are subjects because of the condition they happen to be born into. And if I'm born into a family of smiths, maybe my calling isn't to be a smith, maybe it's to be a weaver or to be an actress. My calling might be something very different than what I happen to be born into. And so liberalism comes into being, you could say in certain respects for very praiseworthy reasons, which is to free us to pursue our genuine vocations, who we authentically are. But of course, what we have seen is that this very process and this very liberation, by creating equal and free human beings, what we have created is a kind of new aristocracy, a new ruling class, which now we call the meritocracy, right? The people who rise because of their own efforts. And this is, I think, as a growing number of authors and critics are beginning to recognize. I'm actually reading a book right now by the Harvard political theorist Michael Sandel called The Tyranny of Merit. And this is really the condition now in which we see we've created a new kind of ruling class whose claim to rule isn't much better than the old aristocracy's claim to rule. In fact, in some ways, it could even be worse, because the meritocrats, the people who make it, think they deserved it, think they earned it. I like your dog, Joshua Haverkamp. Is that a Bernese?
He's He's a border collie Australian
Okay.
Shepherd.
Okay.
He just loves attention.
I got a dog with very similar colors laying right at my feet right now. Okay, so to finish up, so that what we've done is created a new aristocracy that believes itself to be ruling entirely because they have earned their position, and those who are not in the ruling class internalize the belief that they have failed because of their own bad choices. Right? And so we have a kind of dysfunctional sort of ruling class and a dysfunctional class of people that no longer rule. And really, I think was in many ways has been the reason and the impetus for the rise of what we call populism, is an uprising against this new aristocracy, right? One that continues to have, is able to generate itself perpetually. If you follow the recent stories about manipulation of college admissions and some of the actresses who were, sort of quite visibly involved in this. Well, what we all know is that what these people did by manipulating admissions processes was just only on the side of illegality, on the other side of illegality. It's what the ruling class does all the time legally, is to create the conditions for the success of their children, the perpetuation of the class of successful people who then go on to the best universities, marry each other, and now have a kind of succession of a kind of aristocratic ruling class. So, the title of this talk was The Crisis of Liberalism and What is to be Done About It. And I think I've covered the crisis, but I know I've been talking for a long time. And so I think what I'll do is, rather than give you another half hour on how to solve this, I'm going to stop here, and I'm sure I'm guessing there might be some questions, or at least maybe some things we can continue to talk about. Maybe I'll be able to, I'm sure I'll be asked, what do we do if I'm right? And we can talk about a little bit about that. So let me stop now and see what you might have to say. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Deneen. And yes, we do have a few questions here already, and I would encourage people who have questions to put them in chat. I know some of you may have to go in the next 10 or 15 minutes, but we will hang out for a while longer than that. So the first question is from Abdul, and he says, "Hi, Dr. Deneen, thank you for your time. Do you think American liberalism should keep a moderate approach, or should it change and follow a European-like system with more social welfare programs?"
Well, so that's a great question. Now, it's interesting, when my book appeared in winter of 2018, and it was several months after that President Obama gave it a shout out. So it didn't get its sort of real big push until then. But when the book came out, it actually did get a lot of attention because it was published just, sort of after the election of Donald Trump, but also after the surprising outcome of the Brexit vote in England, and a number of populist uprisings throughout Europe, Italy, obviously, and growing populist presence even in places, the more Scandinavian countries you might be thinking of, Germany, Denmark, Sweden. And what surprised me in the weeks right after the book came out were the number of journalists from Scandinavian countries who wanted to interview me. So the first interview I did, in fact, was with a Danish newspaper, and now I've become kind of a star in the Danish press. Is actually kind of interesting. I wouldn't have expected this. So I'll be actually commenting on the election on election night for a Danish television station. Go figure. And what surprised me about this is that I would have thought that, what I was describing, I really thought was an American problem, but it turns out it's a global problem. And it's a global problem, you could say, in some ways, for opposite reasons. When I talked about the state and the way that liberalism relies increasingly on statism, on the depersonalized mechanism of our relationality. In America, I think the state has been strengthened because we started as individuals. Right? When you start off as a society that's very individualistic, the irony is that you become more and more statist. Because the fewer and fewer of those institutions that I was talking about, the sort of bowling alone, the kinds of associations, family life, religious life, community life, and so forth, the fewer and fewer of those institutions that you have, in some senses, to rely upon as you go through life, the more and more you're going to have to rely on the institutions of the state to sort of assist you in the course of your life, especially when you have crises that you're going to inevitably encounter. Now, this is an argument that Tocqueville makes toward the end of Democracy in America. He calls this the rise of democratic despotism, because he, again, prophetically foresees that a society of people who are highly individualistic will actually ultimately become, oddly enough, kind of more and more subjects of the state, because the state will increasingly become centralized. Now, the irony is in places like parts of Europe is that they begin much more statist. And because I think in many ways the European society has much more of a kind of tradition of, more of the liberal tradition that you would say runs through figures like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and obviously Karl Marx and Hegel and so forth. So a different strand of the more continental strand of the liberal tradition than the Anglo liberal tradition that I was discussing. But this tradition really emphasizes how our condition of freedom and equality, so free equality, is the result of being largely taken care of and running our relationships through the state. So you need the state to broker these relationships. And what we're seeing in Europe today are the same features of individualism that we're seeing in the United States, right? And in some ways, the two continents are becoming very similar in terms of this kind of barbell of having highly, highly individualistic societies in which people aren't forming families, they aren't having children, they aren't joining associations, they aren't joining religious institutions, and so forth. And also increasing the centralized state, with one of the results being the rise of increasingly sort of more populist movements rejecting this settlement in both countries. So all this is by way of saying, I think that the solution probably doesn't lie in the Scandinavian solution, in as much as they seem to be tracking the same kinds of problems that we are experiencing. And their interest in these questions strikes me as driven by similar kinds of concerns. And that ultimately what we, this would really be my answer to the question of what is to be done. It's to really begin thinking about fostering mechanisms of repersonalization. That would be the way I would, sort of describe it in a social sciencey way, to push back against these depersonalizing mechanisms that increasingly define the life of a modern liberal citizen, and to begin thinking about how to, through creative policy, but also through just a kind of change in how we think of ourselves, kind of, a change in thinking about our human nature, to think about developing the kind of mechanisms of repersonalization. And some of those might be some of those more traditional associations that I've already mentioned, but some of them are going to be new. Some of them are going to be very different. Some of them, I think, will require a certain amount of creativity. And one of the things I encourage my students to do is to think about it, and as they assume positions of influence in industry and government and so forth, is to think about ways that you can creatively foster mechanisms of repersonalization in our society that seem to me to be essential for any kind of flourishing human society, and without which what we're likely to experience is the growing illiberalism of liberalism, the illiberal illiberalism of liberalism, which I think we're seeing happening at an accelerating rate, a kind of oppressive liberalism on the one hand, and a kind of more right-wing reaction against this. I don't think the next election, in a month's time, is going to settle this problem for us. Anyone who thinks that, okay, after November 3rd or however many months it takes to figure out who won the election, all will be well. I think anything but. And if we can't develop, mechanisms of, or I don't want to talk about this, but if we can't develop far more thick forms of personal relationships on the ground, I just don't see how we survive as a civilization. So anyway, good question and too long an answer. So.
Thank you. We have another one from John Schaefer. Hi, Dr. Deneen. The principle of the bowling alone book is very interesting to me. However, when I think of the era of bowling leagues, I feel many aspects of liberalism were already in place. Is it possible that liberty from association manifested itself after the liberty from religion and marriage?
Interesting. What was that? Can you read what kind of bowling leagues?
He says, when I think of the era of bowling
Era.
leagues,
Okay, thank you.
yeah.
Okay, I misunderstood the word. I thought it was Arab bowling leagues. I wasn't sure what that meant. The era of bowling. No, it's really it's a really interesting question, and there's been a lot of debate over what is the reason, what was the mechanism, what was the causal factor in the decline of associational life in America, and that was, I mean, one of the things that really differentiated America from Europe, even over the last, let's say, before the last 20 years, was that America, while a country much more individualistic than Europe, historically more individualistic, nevertheless, it was also a country that had much more robust associational life than Europe had. That in many ways, I think the more statist model of Europe had crowded out a lot of those associations and institutions a lot earlier. Sort of after World War II in particular, you really begin to see rapid declines of religiosity, of sort of associational life, of family formation, of having children. I mean, the cratering of reproduction rates in Europe began, decades ago, and they're just beginning we're just beginning to see the same things here in the United States. So something really did happen in a more recent period of time. And I do think that, we can look to aspects of the post-World War II world in the United States. I do think that, in many ways it was, I think the premise behind the question is correct in many ways, that the ideal of the individuated self-making self became in many ways dominant. It became the dominant way of thinking about ourselves, particularly after World War II. It comes into sort of full blown, you could say, in two ways. In 1968, you see it sort of really come into being on the kind of political left, especially with the student movements, the hippie movements, sort of authenticity, be yourself, the kind of liberation from all of these encroaching social institutions. And then you have a kind of corresponding revolution on the right in the 1980s, where the same arguments kind of get made about the market by figures like Ronald Reagan, by thinkers like Milton Friedman. We should be able to do anything we want in the marketplace. There should be no limits to what we do in the marketplace. So what precedes this? I do think it was its extreme weakening of a kind of what had been a strong American religiosity. And if you think about it, America, in many ways, the original rationale for America was that people of various religious traditions could come to America and freely exercise in their religious traditions. But over time, this ideal of freely practicing our religious traditions became transformed into the ideal of freely being whoever we wanted to be. And even the religious traditions themselves increasingly reflected that. Right? The religions became much more sort of oriented toward material expression of our selfhood. Right? So think about, for example, Joel Osteen and the prosperity gospel. Right? That God just wants you to be rich. That's what God really wants. And if you're a good person, you'll become a wealthy person. So I do think that there are deeper explanations for what happened. And I think, but this goes to the heart of what I was arguing, that at some point, and it's probably kind of like the frog being boiled, a kind of gradual sort of accumulation of this sort of increasingly liberal understanding of ourselves, at some point the kind of balance tips inevitably away from almost a kind of, you could say, pre-liberal set of practices that many Americans engaged in, to this much more radical sense of self-realization, self-actualization, meritocracy that comes into full bloom just really only in the last 20 to 30 years, arguably. So I would argue there was a kind of gradual process that really suddenly, like the frog being boiled, suddenly the frog notices, hey, this is really dang hot. It was nice and warm a couple of minutes ago, and now it's really hot. So I think it was probably a gradual process, but which once it was noticed, really accelerated and kind of built on itself.
Okay, this question is from Bryant. He says, thank you for the thought-provoking presentation. As the issues you identified are in fact larger than a singular polity, does this seem to indicate that a counter-revolution to 1848 is upon us, or is this simply a cyclical wave of human history?
That's a great question. Who asked that question?
Bryant McFarlane.
Okay. Come study political philosophy with me, Brian. That's a great question. I think that's the question. That's the live question right now. And since the publication of this book, I've become now really caught up in a lot of these debates, which are all premised essentially on what does the post-liberal world look like. So this was a completely unexpected development. I was describing what I saw as the internal trajectory of liberalism, and to put full admission on the table, I was really just completely stealing Alexis de Tocqueville, who makes essentially this argument in his book Democracy in America. In other words, what Tocqueville does is say, what are the inherent features of democracy that, if they are left unchecked, are likely to will result in the contradiction of its own self, right? So I mentioned he has this final set of chapters in which he talks about democracy leading to the rise of democratic despotism. That sort of the opposite condition of democracy arises not because of an external imposition, but because of its own internal logic. Now, Tocqueville was just stealing from Plato. I mean, this is a long-standing argument you can encounter in a lot of the great thinkers, that every political system, in a sense, has its own internal weaknesses that will come out over time. This is really the argument that I pursue about the nature of liberalism. When I made this argument, when I began writing about this, I wasn't expecting that there would be this full-blown kind of crisis that would be widely felt across most of the world's liberal democracies. Right? The kind of loss of confidence and even loss of support for essentially liberal positions. And so this discussion and debate now over the possibility or prospect of a post-liberalism, it seems to me is taking on some really interesting shapes, some of which are, to go to the first question, are questions about whether a kind of more socialist form of a post-liberalism is desirable. Does the future portend overturning the kind of traditional individualistic idea of American liberalism with some very different understanding of how we base the political order? And you're also seeing the development of some more conservative or right post-liberal visions. And of course, some of these are genuinely worrying in terms of sort of fascist, racist articulations. But the ones that I think are the more interesting and the more viable, I would hope, are ones that are interested in discussing, which go back to what I began by talking about, interested in discussing whether and in what ways a political order has to be attentive to the formation of virtuous characters. Right? Is there a way that any political order can escape the question and challenge of the formation of character? And is there a role and a place for a political order as big and as diverse and in many ways unwieldy as ours in taking up that challenge? Now, I personally, sort of philosophically, this is where my own preferences lie. But I'd be the first to acknowledge the extreme sort of systemic and I think sort of practical situational challenges to that, precisely because I think America is in many ways too big and obviously too internally divided right now. And it's why my own inclination tends to go toward much more modest local forms of, proposing more local and modest forms of sort of intentional formation within intentional communities. That's not a global universal solution, political solution, but I actually think that global universal political solutions are probably more dangerous right now than the alternative. In other words, I suppose I'm enough of a conservative to say I'm wary of any call for revolution. There's a good Burkean statement for you.
Thank you. I have a question from Christian Simson, and I know you've already spoken to the question of Christianity to a certain extent, but this is more specific, so I'll ask this, and then Dr. Warner has a question. Christian says, hi, Dr. Deneen. John Locke has had many good points made in regards to liberalism, but do you feel as though his views on God as a sovereign power make it so many modern liberals won't revere him? And I think he means revering God, but Christian, do you want to maybe clarify?
I did mean revering God, sorry.
Okay.
So it's interesting. It's an interesting question. I mean, it's interesting historically and theologically because John Locke, during his own time, was regarded as something of a heretic by many of his readers. And that question has been widely debated, and it continues to be debated, whether Locke was in some ways an Orthodox Christian by certain understandings, or whether he was actually kind of heretical in some of his views toward God and toward Christianity. I mean, some of the things Locke writes seem to indicate that he was a deist of some type, which was was kind of the fashionable, let's say the philosophically more unorthodox position to hold at the time. It wasn't denying the existence of God. In fact, it acknowledged the existence of God, but it more or less held the view that God created the universe and then, to use the metaphor of the time, like a great watchmaker, wound it up and let it run. So it didn't deny that there was the possibility of providence in the world, because the watchmaker can make it in such a way that it runs only in one particular way. It only runs in one direction if you're a good watchmaker, and it will run on time. But it did deny that God sort of had a continual presence intervening in the world. And so, of course, this is, of course, quite unchristian argument, right? To suggest that Christ wasn't really, kind of an extraordinary intervention in the form of the incarnation in the human world at a particular point in human history. So at any rate, these are topics that are debated. I think what's interesting is that there is in the intellectual world, there's a category of thinkers who are highly religious, strongly identified with the Christian tradition in particular. Many of them are fellow Catholics of my own religious faith, who are ardent admirers and supporters of John Locke and Lockeanism, and who regard him as a very deeply faithful thinker. In other words, there's a strand of thinking in America, and I think it's a strand that you could say seeks to preserve the liberal tradition that traces itself all the way back to the American founding, that regard themselves as both sort of political, we would call them conservatives. They're on the conservative side of the American political spectrum. So we would think of Ronald Reagan as a political figure, thinkers, might include someone like Robert George at Princeton University, Jonah Goldberg, for those of you who read conservative press. Jonah Goldberg is a big John Locke fan. He's not a Christian, but he's a big John Locke fan, who view the Lockean argument as the founding and essential argument of the American tradition, and regard it also as ultimately supportive of the Christian tradition, that Locke himself was a good Christian, but more than that, Locke's argument, and I think this is the classical liberal argument, Locke's argument is the argument that's used to support the possibility and prospect of religious diversity, right? That in a Lockean world, and so the other major work that you would want to read by John Locke is his famous letter concerning toleration, that Locke articulates one of the early arguments for religious toleration. In other words, what we think of today as the diversity of religious traditions coexisting, in which all are able to pursue their religious beliefs without impinging upon the rights of anyone else to pursue their own religious beliefs. So you can have a variety of churches, a variety of religious traditions, but they all agree that none of them is going to claim some kind of authoritative position in terms of ruling political society. And so by this understanding, you could say that Locke offers an argument that supports precisely the kind of robust religious tradition that America enjoyed until recent times. Right? And that was one of the attractions for many people initially to come to America, so that they could practice their religion freely, not being persecuted by the official established religion of the countries they came from, like the original Puritans who come to America. The problem in many ways with this argument, or at least let's say the challenge that people like me are putting up, is that the logic in some ways of Locke's argument of toleration ultimately begins to move against religion itself. Because what does religion do, among other things? It insists that the people who are adherents of that religion have to follow and believe in certain strictures on their own individual liberty and on their own personal belief. Right? That to become a member of a religious community, and that there are boundaries set up within those religious communities to what you ought and ought not to do. And so one recent experience of this has been, within the Catholic tradition, we hold the view that artificial contraception is not acceptable. It's not in accordance with the natural law. It's an effort to obstruct God's command that we should be fruitful and multiply. And Catholic institutions in particular, after the passage of Obamacare and some of the directives of the HHS director at the time, Kathleen Sebelius, resisted the directive that contraception should fall under a covered benefit in healthcare under Obamacare. And this has been an area of a lot of conflict, obviously. Not only this area, but areas relating to gay marriage, to transsexuality, and so forth. And in a liberal society, the belief that everyone in those institutions should be able to order themselves according to liberal ends, free and the free and equal human being, is inevitably going to come into conflict with the strictures and limitations within those religious communities. So I think we're seeing, in some ways, the realization of the kind of tension within Locke's own thought is really the short part of this long answer. One way you could see this moving is in a kind of a rebellious attitude toward any authority, including ultimately the authority that there's a God that orders the world in such a way. So John Locke might personally have been very religious, very pious, but there's an aspect or trajectory of his thinking that contributes to a kind of rebelliousness, just as there's an aspect of his thinking that offers an area of protection for religious liberty. And so that, this issue, this isn't just a philosophical issue on the pages of this old dead white male. This is a live debate that's taking place in real time in our country today. And one of the reasons why the country is really deeply divided, because it's deeply divided over these, you could say, these two understandings that exist within liberalism itself.
Okay, thank you. Okay, this question is from John Warner. Hi, Patrick. I'm curious to hear more about your view, hear about how you view more contemporary forms of multicultural liberalism, which seek to reconcile the human need for rootedness in institutional and cultural forms with the familiar liberal commitments, i.e., individual liberty, equality under the law, etc. I'm thinking in particular of Will Kymlicka and Alan Paton, who have emphasized the importance of cultural group rights. Is this last gasp liberalism? A promising way forward? Something else? Thank you for a most interesting talk.
It's a great question. I'm not going to assume everyone knows the writings of Will Kymlicka and Alan Paton. It is striking that they're both Canadians, and so they come out of a somewhat different tradition than the American tradition. And there has been this very much this development in the last several decades especially in Canada, of precisely this idea of multicultural, a multicultural form of liberalism. And I think it's fair to say that what I was just talking about, the topic I was just talking about, really is really lies at the heart of this question, right? So if liberalism, if we understand liberalism as a kind of an umbrella, think about it as a bowl. Right? Think of liberalism as a kind of bowl into which you can pour a stew. And that stew has all of these different chunks in it, and you can tell what's in the stew. There's a potato, there's a carrot, there's a piece of beef or something. And a good stew doesn't require that you turn it into a frappe, turn it into a shake. Here, Joshua, I'll show you. Come here. Hold on. I don't know if you can see. There's my dog. Bernese mountain dog. That a good stew doesn't require you to make all the chunks into nothing, into unidentifiable mess. And this is precisely, I think, the tension that you see within liberalism itself. Right. So let's say that the carrot in the stew says, "I am really sick of being a carrot. I want to be a potato. I'm rebelling against this carrotness that you're forcing upon me." What does a liberal do in that context? And I think the really liberal has to say, well, you have to create or protect the condition in which the carrot, or the individual in this case, is able to exit or depart from that condition of carrotness, right? And this is a long-standing debate within liberal theory, is how strong or how active, especially, does a liberal state need to be in protecting the rights of exit. Right? Now, that said, I think it's, and this is probably treacherous grounds to be on, but for a culture to genuinely be able to patrol its boundaries, there have to be relatively high bars to exit. In other words, there have to be, it can't be just a simple matter of exiting. Right? So think, for example, I'll give you an example of this, right? One of the few genuinely distinct cultures that exist in the United States today. I'm not talking about popular culture. I'm not talking about, country music, NASCAR and so forth. I'm talking about a really identifiable culture. When you see these people, you know them. And they live a very distinct way of life. They surround me where I live. They're all within 20 miles, 30 miles of where I live. It's the Amish. It's the old order Amish. That's a very distinct culture, right? When we talk about culture, this is the way I want to think of it for this moment, which is a comprehensive order that claims the duty and the obligation to shape the kind of human being you are, right? To put into your, from the very earliest moment of your life, right? To shape what you think is right and wrong, what you think the world, how the world is actually ordered. And so again, when we think of the old order Amish, when you're driving down Route 20 here in Indiana, you know them when you see them, because they, among other things, go back to that my brief mention of technology, right? In a liberal society, any technology that allows us greater liberation from each other or from the world, right? Virtual reality goggles and so forth, that's a good technology. There's no argument to limiting that technology. It becomes a matter of market choice, and the market will speak. People will want to adopt it. Right? We're constantly debating, should parents have some way to limit the ability of their kids to partake or imbibe, technology of the internet via cell phones and so forth. But that becomes an individual choice, and it's very hard. I speak as a parent. It's very hard to patrol that once your kids are online, once they have cell phones. And I'm pretty sure we tried to fight it, but we pretty much lost that battle. Well, the Amish have a very easy way to answer. In our community, we only adopt technology that strengthens our community or keeps it as strong as it is. And if there's any form of technology that weakens our community, we're going to reject it. We're not going to allow our members to adopt it. Right? And this includes things like the internal combustion engine, which I think they rightly see as destructive of community. And interestingly, it includes things like insurance, which we tend not to think of as technology. But think about what insurance is. Insurance is that one of those depersonalized mechanisms. So when you take on insurance, car insurance, life insurance, and so forth, what you're saying is that I know I live in a world of risk, and you all know you live in a world of risk. And so what we're going to do is we're going to minimize our risk by throwing our money at some third party. And I don't know you, and you don't know me. I don't know anyone else who's in this insurance pool. And and then when something bad happens to me, I will literally file a claim. I will make a claim on that insurance pool. And without you or anyone else in that insurance pool ever knowing about what happened to me, what my auto accident was, or what member of my family died, I'm able to receive some compensation for that risk. Now the Amish, at least some of the old order Amish, forbid members of their community, of their culture, from adopting insurance because they want the obligation and duty to be personal. So if something bad happens to you, we are responsible for you. That's what the nature of our community. So if your barn burns down, all of the members of our community are going to turn out next Saturday and we're going to build you a new barn. That's a hell of a lot more activity and obligation than putting a check in the mail to Travelers Insurance Company once a month. So all this is to say that in a culture needs to, in some ways, be comprehensive. Now, in a liberal society, when an Amish person says, let me step back. In Amish society, actually requires, when you reach the age of adulthood, or close to it, around 18 years old or so, requires you to go out into the world and live in the world for about 1 or 2 years. And then to make the decision, they call this Rumspringa, literally in German meaning running around. So you get your sort of teenage jollies out during that period of time. There's actually a terrible movie about it I don't recommend. But the object and aim is at the end of this, you make a decision. And it's a decision that most religious traditions sort of have in their own way. In Catholic tradition, it's confirmation, which is really a kind of watered down version of this. In the Amish tradition, the decision is after this 2 years of experiencing life outside of our community, outside of our culture, you are asked whether, will you return to our community on the following terms? You will accept the terms of our culture and our community for the rest of your life. And if you don't, you are barred from our community. So you have a right of exit, but you don't have a right of reentry. Now, this is a community that's shaped you, that's taught you everything, that's shaped your worldview. And there was a book written several years ago called Rumspringa that showed that 90% of the Amish decide to re-enter the Amish community after this period of Rumspringa. Now, in my first academic job, I was teaching at Princeton, which was filled with good liberals. They thought this was outrageous. They thought it was terrible that a culture should have so much influence over the choice of the young people, right? And so I asked my colleague at the time, I said, what would be the percentage that would indicate to you that they were actually choosing freely? Because their argument was that we can't, there's no way in the world that we can think that they were actually genuinely freely choosing because they've been so brainwashed by this upbringing, is the view. And my colleague said it would have to be 50% or less. You would know that it was a genuinely liberal culture, a more deeply liberal culture, if half or more people left that culture. And you could say this is, in some ways, you could say this is a reflection on where we are today, because that's literally the likelihood of young people remaining in the religious tradition in which they're raised outside of very small number of religious traditions today, half or less. In Catholic world, it's about 40% of young people are likely to remain Catholics once they reach the age of adulthood. Some religions even less. So you could say multiculturalism within the liberal frame already isn't really cultural, because it's already so deeply embedded and infiltrated by deeply liberal assumptions about what constitutes an acceptable culture, that it seems to me that it remains ultimately acceptable within liberalism to the extent that these cultures are sufficiently liberal. And something like the Amish are, they're an interesting oddity. and the question came before the American Supreme Court a number of years ago on the question of whether Amish young people should be able, Amish parents should be able to withdraw their children from school before the age of 18. And the Supreme Court narrowly decided that they should be allowed, but a strong dissent was lodged by William O. Douglas, justice at the time, who argued that this was a limitation on their freedom. It ought really not to be allowed. But he went on to say, as long as it's a very small number of people in the broader American situation, then it's probably acceptable. But if this became a larger number of people, then the state would have an obligation to go in and sort of break things up. So I think a genuine multiculturalism is probably, in the way I'm describing it, is probably not sufficiently liberal for liberals. And a multiculturalism within a liberal context is a cultural, it depends upon cultures essentially being weakened by deeper liberal presuppositions. I'm sorry, that's a long answer, but it's an important question, so I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Dr. Deneen. I think we kind of committed to ending at this time, and so we probably better go ahead and do that. There are a couple of more questions. I'll save them and I'll send them to you in case you have any response to them. But we really appreciate you taking the time today to talk to us. Extremely interesting. There's so many things to think about. I'm going to watch this again several times. We'll put this up online for people who couldn't make it today. So,
well, thank you. I appreciate it, and it's nice. I haven't been teaching for just about a year, so it's actually really nice to talk with you all. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the invitation. Next time, I hope I can come to Kansas.
Thank you so much, and take care.
Thanks. Okay. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.